I wanted to welcome all of you. My name is Karen Hladik. I'm a member of the Graduate School Alumni Association Council, and I am very, very pleased to introduce Tarun Khanna, who is a business economics PhD, as am I, and a few other people in the audience, one of the original joint degree programs. So quite an experience we were reminiscing about. So Tarun Khanna is the Georgie Paolo Lemon Professor at Harvard Business School and the first director of Harvard's university-wide Lakshmi, Mittal, and Family South Asia Initiative. He has a lot of publications, as you can imagine. His various books range from Billions of Entrepreneurs, which is a first-person 2008 comparison of Chinese and Indian entrepreneurial ecosystems, to a 2022 co-edited collection of essays, Making Meritocracy, all chronicling the creativity exercised by entrepreneurs for societal development. At Harvard, he teaches at HBS and also at Harvard College, and his online course, Entrepreneurship in Emerging Economies, has been taken by nearly 1 million students in over 200 countries. So please join me in welcoming Professor Khanna to begin his presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Tarun Khanna. It's lovely to meet you all. I'm not used to speaking in a classroom with no windows, so that's post-lunch. That's an unnerving experience, but we'll make do. It's lovely to see some of my classmates and friends from the time that I was in the PhD program here. Really nice to see friendly faces in the audience. I have a small disclaimer. I kind of ruptured my tendon, so I'm post-surgery and limping a bit, so I may sit in the middle if I need to, but hopefully I will not. Okay, so there really aren't too many topics that arouse more excitement, fervor, angst than this idea of meritocracy and favoritism, and of course it manifests very directly in college admissions, right? So we experience that every year. Society is always up in arms against some version of it or other, perceived or actual unfairness. The courts are constantly ruling on it, and it's a perennial. So some years ago, Michael Sonny, who is a professor of Chinese history at Harvard, lovely gentleman, and I got together to just shoot the breeze about how talent is allocated in societies, in China and India in particular. For background, my degree is originally in applied mathematics and then business economics. And so I tend to see more or less everything like an algorithm, for better and for worse, it must be said. And over the course of the last 25, 30 years, in addition to being an academic, I had built several companies and some nonprofits. And many of them were in this trying to work on this very complicated problem of what do you do about unfairness in society, particularly vis-a-vis talent. Because in most countries, the very vast swaths of talent are somehow left by the mainstream. And through a combination of luck, happenstance, circumstance, effort, small fractions of people get to participate in the mainstream. And you see that here as well in America. And a lot of my efforts, academic, entrepreneurial, were about this. And several of them were in mainland China and on the Indian subcontinent. So that's kind of what got us into this. And Michael, of course, was approaching it through the lens of Chinese history. And together with Wang Yi, who is a Harvard College graduate, who runs the Harvard China Fund in Shanghai, we would have many nice glasses of wine debating the pros and cons of a meritocratic society. So that's the genesis of this. And oh yes, Mark Elliott, who's currently Vice Provost for International Affairs, was also an interlocutor in the midst of this until he ascended to the administrative heavens to his detriment, and left Michael and me with the pleasurable task of leading this project. So this project basically culminated in an edited volume, which Michael and I had the pleasure of editing. And it was, truth be told, a very intellectually stimulating but very difficult task for me, because the essays are written by some of the world's leading philosophers, historians, legal scholars, mathematicians, all playing from their own disciplinary biases to this idea of what can we say about the problem of appropriate, efficient, ethical allocation of talent in society. And as you would not be surprised to know, there are many, many different perspectives on this. So on the cover of this, you have the examination systems in India and in China. For those of you who are familiar, they would make our selection system seem laughable in comparison in terms of how draconian. And I did compete for the Indian exam before I came to Princeton to study as an undergrad. Honestly, the Ivy League was a walk in the park compared to how intense the training and the some would say madness was in many parts of Asia, simply because the numbers are so large.
So you're saying that India is sending its failures to us?
Is what, sorry?
India is sending its failures to us.
As in me. Also, a lot of the deans running around here. Yeah. As Mr. Trump would tell us, you got to be careful what you import. Yeah. So this is the culmination of actually what is a very fun project. There were 50 odd scholars, maybe 14 or 18 of whose essays appear in this book. But there was a much larger constellation of people. So we met periodically, of course, in Cambridge, in New Delhi at the Mittal Institute, Harvard Mittal Institute offices, at the Harvard China Fund offices in Shanghai, at the Chinese Party School several times in Beijing and Shanghai, which was really a surreal experience for many, particularly the Indians. I'm more of a half insider, so it wasn't so surreal for me. But nonetheless, just very different settings and always debating the same things. So that's what I was going to talk to you about, some basic ideas. And of course, I'm going to give you my spin on it, which is idiosyncratic, and I'm not a trained historian or a trained philosopher, but I'll try to give you the essence in plain English for what I took away from it as one scholar's take on this. The punchline of this book is that all the stuff that we hear about here, it ain't nothing new. Societies have been going through this over and over again, the exact same debate, the exact same tensions for millennia. The essays in this book date back to dealing with periods that are 1,000 years old, and you can see the same debates. And I'll articulate more by what I mean by the same debates and the same conundrums and the same tensions and the same version of Sisyphus pushing a boulder up the hill, only to find that it's reversed by some court ruling and then you start all over again. So this movie has been played out in society after society. And so on this front, at least, there is no American exceptionalism. Whatever else you might think, it is entirely routine what we go through. It just seems angst-ridden and fervor-ridden at that point in time. But it's the oldest thing in the world, is the punchline of this book. That's why it's called Making of Meritocracy. We want to draw attention to the idea that meritocracy is never a finished product. In fact, almost axiomatically, it cannot be, because there are forces that prevent it from becoming so. And so it's always in the act of making I think as well-wishers in society, responsible actors, maybe even influential people, maybe policymakers, we need to be mindful of this seduction of some perfect system that just doesn't exist. That's what history tells us. That's what time and space tell us across at least two large civilizational land masses. When you see them mirroring. And personally, I would say that my work is all in developing countries. My chair is Brazilian, so I spend all my time across Latin America, Middle East, and of course China and India. And it's the same everywhere, honestly. One of my students just went back and pulled together some New York Times and Wall Street Journal headlines, and the purpose of this was to illustrate that this is timeless. Okay, so this first one here is from 1944, basically saying that these white-collar guys get paid too much, right? And we ought to put a cap on it, right? And so there was a proposal floating around, and this one is a very contentious ruling by the court at the time, also in the 40s, I think, 48, that basically said, yes, companies have the right to decide pay increments for their workers, but you know what? The unions also have a right to have a say in it. And you could imagine that the union might curtail a merit pay because they will have some notion of egalitarianism in there and kind of, from the point of view of the company, disrupt pay for performance as an idea. So super contentious debate that was acted out in the courts at the time. This one is more recent, 1980s. What's the merit in merit pay? I believe it's the governor of North Carolina basically saying our public schools are getting worse every day. And the way to combat this is to pay teachers for doing good work. And so let's pay merit pay to teachers, which, as you can imagine, was opposed tooth and nail by the unions at the time and probably scuttled. Again, the purpose is 1940, 1948, 1980, and I could go on and on. Right? So again, the point is to say that this is a timeless discussion, and it isn't always moving in one direction. It's kind of like swinging back and forth, depending on the issue and the time. There was a nice quote that I was reminded by a current New York Times columnist, David Brooks, who said that something, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to remember exactly, but something to the effect of the singular achievement of the modern elite, American elite. That's you guys. The modern American elite is to have managed to organize a bipartisan revolt against itself, which I think captures where we're at right now. And the column basically says, this is an extraordinary accomplishment, actually, that we've all managed, we meaning the elite, have managed to basically shoot ourselves in the head. And everybody agreed this was a good idea. So here we are. And of course, you will remember not 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, in June of 2023, the courts basically said that that Harvard and UNC in particular, and by extension, American education, can no longer use race as a I don't know what the word was. There was a lot of sort of hemming and hawing, but you cannot use race directly or as a category to influence admissions because it is unfair to, as I recall, white people and Asian Americans, something like this. So again, contemporary debates. So in this book, the very first thing we confront is, and I'm sure many of you are thinking, but what is merit? So I have nothing to say about that, actually. But I do have a sleight of hand, which is to say that it doesn't matter what you think merit is, that for the arguments in this book, we will simply take your definition of merit as posited and suggest that there are certain truths regardless of how you choose to define merit. And one of the actually fun exercises is to go through the chapters in the book. And everybody is, as I was saying, a scholar approaching it from his or her own discipline: sociology, economics, political science, anthropology, mathematics, statistics, law, and is typically anchored in a particular time period. It could be in the case of our friend Michael Pewitt, who is a professor of Chinese philosophy here. His essay is anchored in the time of Confucius and Mencius, going all the way back to 4 centuries BC and 6 centuries BC. Or it could be people concerned with contemporary debates. And the definitions of merit are all over the place. For instance, and it's always contextual, right? So somebody in the time of the Qing dynasty in China or the Mughal Empire in India, let's say in the 1500s or 1600s, would say that the ultimate definition of merit was whether you could you had equestrian skills and could wield a sword. That was the thing that most ensured that you moved through society. Not that you could read and write. That was the thing that was most prized. And oh yes, loyalty was considered to be a precondition to be meritorious in most empires of the time, which kind of makes sense because the big poobah, the emperor, is saying that if you're not loyal, then you can't be meritorious and you cannot advance, right? So loyalty turned out to be, in the definitions of merit at the time, a central component. I'm thinking of the current White House also as to what constitutes merit. What's another example? In the time of Mencius, in the 4th century BC, the preeminent constituent of merit, the necessary condition to be meritorious was to be virtuous. Right? If you were not virtuous by whatever was the standard of the time, you simply were not meritorious. It didn't matter whether you could, recite a poem or compute things or, demonstrate mastery of the Chinese classics. You simply were not meritorious if you were not virtuous. So definitions vary dramatically over time and space. And so we adopt, as I said, the sleight of hand to say, we don't care. We're going to posit that merit is always a function of ability and effort, and that both ability and effort are contextually determined, and therefore merit is contextually determined. And regardless of your definition of merit, I will advance some propositions that appear to be universally true. Okay, that's the sleight of hand. By the way, please interrupt me anytime. Yeah, go ahead.
Don't say what is not merit is ancestry, possibly merit is beauty, merit.
So beauty sometimes is. Beauty sometimes is. Ancestry is not. So it's always, it's a fair point. The juxtaposition, the counterfactual system of allocation is always something to do with hereditary. That's usually in fact, the term meritocracy, some of you would know, is a very recent invention. 1958, Michael Young in England concocted this awkward term. And actually the opening lines of his essay or book, I forget what it was, basically contrasted against family orientation. So thank you for that. You should think of that as a counterfactual in some ways, but not beauty. Beauty is absolutely a part of merit in many parts, many societies. That unless you have certain aesthetic characteristics, you may not be virtuous, for instance, as crazy as it sounds. So, yeah.
Does it go back to religion? Christian religion, you merit to go to heaven, and you go to
Yeah. So, the essays here don't really engage with religion directly, but tangentially they do. And religion is often, unsurprisingly, interwoven with what one considers to be virtuous. So in a sense, it's in there lurking, but I don't know that I'm comfortable making any pronouncements on it. Let me give you a sense of what's in, please interrupt anytime, but let me give you a sense of what's in the book. These are the chapters. I'll just highlight a few that I like. Not that I don't like the other ones, but I leave mine out. But few that were memorable to me because they said something interesting. There's a philosophical section. There's a historical section, contemporary China and India, and then prognostication about the if you will, the proximate future, right? So those are sort of the essays. So I referenced Michael Pewitt already, a lovely essay, just a beautiful philosophical essay talking about, and the thing that I most remember from this is Michael pointing out that, look, very often people who have been debating meritocracy have ultimately thrown their hands up and said, you know what, whatever system we come up with, people are going to game. Okay, you come up with a metric, people will find a way to game it. You see that in our admission system and so on. The metrics are creations of human frailty, and sure enough, there's a smarter individual out there who will sidestep it and figure out a way to get around it. So the better thing to do, says Mencius, is don't bother. Just cultivate virtue and make everybody virtuous, and that is actually the best way that you will produce a good society, maybe even a meritorious society, though he's unclear on exactly how it becomes meritorious as a result of just being virtuous, unless you tautologically define merit just as virtue entirely, which is usually not the case. So Michael's essay is a lovely reminder that there is a baseline, which is, we're just flailing away at things that no society has ever solved perfectly. Everybody has gotten hot under the collar and taken a position thus and so, and it's all pointless because we've seen this movie so many different ways at so many different times. So that's Michael. What else? I'm just picking randomly. The ones under contemporary are actually all looking at this idea that these entrance examinations, just like our SAT and so on, are draconian, right? I can speak from personal experience in the Indian case. The admission rate to the Indian Institute of Technology is, I think, now 0.6%. The admission rate to the Indian civil service is 0.1%. So these are like tiny, tiny numbers. And within that, so of course there's a lot of angst about what happens if you say that community has been disadvantaged, a form of affirmative action, and so let's privilege that community by giving them extra points. So you see that in the Gaokao in China, which is the entrance exam, that if you're from certain disadvantaged communities or remote communities, this thing changes every few years, but you get a few extra points, and you get a bump up in how your performance is evaluated and so on. But every time you do that, there's a backlash to it from some other part of society saying, wait a second, that's not fair. Or we did that for long enough. And it mirrors the debates that we've had in this country about. So I should say that in our country, in the United States, it's centrally about race, usually, right? In China, I'm oversimplifying, it's primarily about location, rural, urban, going back to decisions that were made in the party's time when the People's Republic was formed, and how people were told, some of you stay in rural areas with your so-called huku, and some of you stay in urban areas, and so on. In India, it's primarily about caste. That's also a huge oversimplification. But caste fault lines. So if I wear my economist hat for a second and say, ideally you'd want a system of allocation that is blind to your origins, right? Blind to your race, gender, ethnicity, linguistic abilities, and simply somehow manage to assess you in the raw, as it were, and then allocated you to wherever you were of best use to society. That would be the sort of idealized counterfactual, right? In practice, what we have is locational schisms, linguistic schisms, racial schisms, and in India's case, caste-based schisms that get in the way of allocation of talent to the right place. And to put it bluntly, it's a huge mess, and not one on which enormous progress has been made. So let's see. There's a nice essay down here.
Excuse me, can I ask for?
Yes.
I'm fascinated by the caste and merit.
Yeah.
Indian Institute.
Yeah.
Just to get some background, how many of the lower caste people do succeed?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, not many is the summary answer. In fact, this chapter, Ajanta is a good friend of mine. She's an anthropologist who was at Harvard at the time, has moved to New York. But she has a very trenchant essay that basically says the Indian Institute of Technology presents itself as a merit factory where anybody can take that test. This is the draconian test that I took. Presents itself as being a merit factory, but actually if you look at the origins of the people in the admitted class, they tend to be primarily upper caste, people who have made it through. For the same reasons that you see relatively more privileged people making it into the Ivy League, which is that maybe they have some degree of merit in them, but they also have accumulated advantage of resources and access and mentors and all sorts of things. So it's exactly the same debate. Now, what the government of India has done is it has, we use the term in the book, compensatory discrimination, right, has exercised pretty draconian kind of balancing out policies and said that as many as 50% of the seats in the IIT will be reserved for lower caste. 50%. And I think, to not be impolite about it, it's been a disaster. But not to put a value judgment on it, it just hasn't worked. And it's just very difficult. So now you have people who are from the upper caste or the middling caste who are saying, our number of seats got shrunk, right? And these guys get a free ride. And by the way, there's a lot of fraud. People misrepresent themselves as being lower caste just to get in the door, as you would expect. There's always somebody gaming the system, right? That was the point. There's a well-functioning liquid market to buy these certificates, right? And then a well-functioning market of intermediaries that's trying to authenticate these certificates, and blah blah blah. This is Michael Pewett's point, or Mencius's point, that you just aren't smart enough to outwit everybody else. So whatever you do, people will find a way around it. But the short answer to your question is that left unaided, relatively few lower caste kids were getting in, and that resulted in small amounts of, in India, affirmative action is called reservations, small amount of reservations and then larger amount, and now it's a very large amount. And that itself, that is also proving to be a problem. There is an essay here by a political scientist from Johns Hopkins, and then these two gentlemen who are actually from the lowest caste themselves, but are accomplished scholars in India. And so I was particularly pleased to get them to participate in this essay because they wrote their essay in first person, right? This is what we went through, and this is what we're going through. And one of the main points they made was that simply the act of having affirmative action or reservations in India at such a high level ensures that we are completely stigmatized. And that all measure of our achievement, and they're speaking in first person, they're saying all measure of our achievement has been, at least the way they see it or experience it as human beings, has been eviscerated by this well-meant action that has backfired on us. And so can we not find a way to calibrate talent that is less subject to being gamed? And one of their proposals is, can we not use sports, which is a little bit harder. You run, and if you run fast enough, then you're meritorious. It doesn't quite work to judge talent in every way. But it's a very personal, poignant essay that points to, that illustrates a lot of the issues, which is there is a problem, there is unfairness. It is the result of accumulated privilege, also the result of accumulated luck and effort and so on, in a complex brew that's resulted in the status quo, and some people are left out. And so society then says, hey, that's not fair. Let's exercise some compensatory discrimination to correct it. And I was going to say more often than not, well, I will say that. More often than not, it backfires eventually. And then you're back to rethinking what to do. Yeah.
Did any of these essays consider the alternative, like the IIT, right? It's an exam-based system.
Uh-huh.
Clearly, it favors certain financially or certain advantaged kind of members of the society, compared to an alternative, let's say, like the American system, where it's more subjective, right? And
Yeah.
did they ever consider?
Yes.
They will be more biased because now the richer people,
Yes.
richer people are able to influence, more
in more ways, yeah. Yeah, that last statement has, I think, been the experience of most places that have gone down that road of doing what we like to say at the college here or in the Ivy League, that we do this holistic submission, but that provides so many more avenues for subjectivity to creep in.
Jared Kushner has given $15 million for the swimming pool. The Jared Kushner idea, right?
Oh, what is that?
That give $15 million to the swimming pool, right?
And then what? Oh, first admission. Okay, I'm not an expert in Jared Kushner, so fortunately. So, but this essay, the Singaporean example, so that's the one non-China, non-India. It's just the Singaporean example, is wrestling with. It's by one of my very close friends who was the dean of NUS and working initially with the then president of NUS. Just talking about how Singapore, that had a pure examination-based system and has been trying to, quote unquote, embrace creativity as part of its admission process, has just had a fiendishly difficult time of it and has not been able to pull it off. And I don't interpret that as an I don't put value judgment on that attempt. I simply interpret it as an exercise in how difficult it is to switch from one system to another. And there are lots of other examples. James Lee, where's James Lee? James Lee, he's a sociologist at Caltech, a very quantitative sociologist, crunching very, very large data sets of allocation of Chinese talent over a couple of centuries, does show that when you try to go through these regime shifts from one system of talent allocation to the other, it is doable. So he refers to mutable meritocracies as opposed to immutable, mutable meritocracies. But the mutability manifests over literally many, many decades. It's not like there's a policy and you see the results in 2 to 3 years. There's a sustained shift in regime of how we think about it, and then 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, you start to see it show up in the numbers. So I think it's sobering to think about, but also realistic to realize that these attempts to rewire, and this is nothing short of rewiring society, right? You're trying to change the way in which people's progeny get to move around. Rewiring society takes decades. If it even succeeds. Those are some of the chapters. We've got a bunch of our local eminences. Bill Kirby, who is an amazing mentor to me. Varun Agarwal is a mathematician from MIT, who is a serial entrepreneur and has built many algorithm-based companies that are all directed to thinking about talent in the masses, right? So here's a statistic that would remove us from the hallowed halls of the Ivy League, right? Anyone know what percentage of the world's workforce is informal? Any guesses? The world's workforce, informal meaning not in a proper, in a proper company or organization, not protected by labor laws. 70 or 80, any others?
60.
How many?
60.
60. Yeah, it's like 70, 75, 76 is the closest estimate. Yeah, in my country of origin, India, it's 94% is informal, right? And so basically, the very few people who put on a shirt and go and work in a building, they're just out there trying to earn a living somehow, selling something, stitching something, small traders, just kind of trying to go from day one to day two, right? That's the reality. And so what Varun does is, in his company and his mathematics, he devises algorithms that you can administer to that population and find people who exercise some aptitude, which is an enormously creative exercise, a lot harder than writing a paper, right? And shows that he can bring in people, even without college degrees, into society's mainstreams if he is able to show, as a result of their doing well on those aptitude tests, that they're perfectly capable of doing many of the things that our graduates would do. And I've seen it, and I absolutely think that it's possible. So a way to say that is that there's so much talent that's just lying around. And that, to me, has been the central problem of my professional life is how do I think about this? What can I do about it? In some ways, and that's how I met Varun. Okay, so you get a flavor. There's sociologists, historians, philosophers, mathematicians, everybody in this book, which is kind of what made it fun and cool. Yeah, sir.
It seems to me, I'm really not an expert in this, that meritocratic structures are designed to provide moral justification for inequality in societies.
That's one interpretation, yeah.
Connect that?
It's an interpretation. It's not without its truths. That an inevitable corollary to having a meritocracy where there is some criteria on the basis of which you sort people, and then you provide opportunities in response to that sorting, there is ex post inequality. I guess one comment I would make is it would be nice if there was ex ante equality, even if there's ex post inequality, by which I mean that everybody should have a shot at least trying to earn the right to be thought of as meritorious, which is almost never the case, by the way. So my main problem is not with the ex post inequality, it's with the ex ante absence of equality of opportunity to even compete in that. That's my response to it, and that comes up frequently. By the way, there is a philosophical position that the whole idea of meritocracy is nonsense, and that is because talent itself is random, right? You are born, and talent is partly innate, presumably. If you believe that there's any innate component to talent, that's a random act, right? That's sort of the underlying reasoning behind Rawls's theory of justice also, that you don't know what you're going to be born with, so you should have a system that's fair regardless of what you're going to be born with. And if you're going to be born with a random allocation of talent, well, this kind of seems unfair if you got the short end of the stick, and then you are left by society on the roadside. So, yeah.
I don't see women mentioned in any of those.
They're in many of the essays.
Are they really?
They're all over the place, thankfully, as they are here, very thankfully. So, no, they literally are in, I would say, at least 2/3 of the essays, even if none of them are centrally about it.
You're supposed to hold up half of the heavens, right?
Women in my house hold up the entire heaven. I don't know about your house, but between my wife and my daughter, they call the shots, as they should. So, no, but seriously, they are. It is throughout all the essays.
Well, I raised that simply because
Yeah.
I got my PhD here 40 years ago.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there were 3 women that came into the Department of Government, and the only faculty member of the Department of Government was being under the, well, not literally under the table, being harassed sexually. And it took
Yeah. So
12
long
years
too. Yeah.
before that ever came to the light of day,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he was removed from his job.
Yeah.
But now we have a massive number of women in very responsible positions.
Mm-hmm.
And it still doesn't get talked to, strangely enough, in many
Yeah.
organizations.
In most, I mean, I would say that even at in my well, I have multiple corners within Harvard that I exist in, but at Harvard Business School, which is one of my primary appointments, the number of women faculty at the senior levels is quite low. So you're preaching to the choir. I agree with you. And in our case, we often wonder whether there's something about the process of instruction that makes it difficult for women to advance once they do. Because when we recruit faculty at least at the business school, it's pretty much 50-50.
And then, what's happening in Congress right now. Women with babies. And
yeah, that's right. There was that huge thing.
Their baby into nurse,
Yeah,
even
yeah.
in a nice, discreet room,
Yeah.
because then they can't cast their votes.
Yeah, no, and I'm so glad that I think they won that vote, right? The 3 women who brought that up. So, yeah. So, but it is they are in most of the essays in one form or the other. Yeah, ma'am.
To your point about your issue being with the ex ante, I think that's very
Yeah.
elegantly made. I'm very struck by your statement that talent is random, and it gave me a moment to self-reflect. I believe that that's true. I went through a lot of kind of analyzing that. But your statement doesn't reflect, I don't believe, our collective cultural bias or story.
Oh, for sure not. Yeah, yeah.
And I just kind of wonder if that became the dominant cultural story.
Mm-hmm.
If that
Oh, it would be a
became-
sea change.
it-
It would rock the foundations of every society that you know. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean.
Therefore, I can promise you that there'll be lots of people who don't want it to be a sea change. So,
Well, but changing that perception.
Yeah,
You know, with
yeah.
good pop cultural marketing per se.
Yeah.
Now you're talking about opening up the doors to change the application, even on the most
Yeah.
local level.
Mm-hmm.
If that becomes the dominant story about the truth of talent.
Yeah. 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 I mean, you know, I make that statement not out of any deep scholarship, just to be clear, but because my intuition and hunch suggests that it's closer to the truth than the alternative, which is the bias that we all carry around, that thus and so who looks more presentable is probably more talented than someone else who's on the roadside. And I can tell you that I've built 2 exceedingly valuable companies that are based on finding talent in places that you would never look. And they are doing just fine, just fine. And they're outcompeting the IITs and the Bedas and the Tsinghuas. So at least I can tell you that even in the economics, I can make a buck off this idea that there are $20 bills. We had a professor, Dick Caves. Mike will remember, John will remember, you'll remember Dick Caves. He used to frequently say, you know, Tarun, there are lots of $20 bills lying on the sidewalk. You just have to walk around looking for them, right? He was making a different point, but I often remember that, saying that there are often things that are just in plain sight. And when I look at kids that are slightly disadvantaged, that's what I see. I see lost talent. And I think just by giving a small leg up, right? So in the commercial case, the leg up that I gave people was by giving them the ability to generate a signal in the labor market that was credible. Because I gave them a test to take that was not difficult to take. And then as a result of the test, I was able to go to companies and say, listen, this kid who looks like, you know, he just crawled out of a hole, outscored all these other kids from these fancy schools on this test. Why don't you take a look for free? If you hire him, you pay me $1. And it worked, right? So obviously it's one person's experience or one company's experience, but I can't help but think that there's got to be more stuff out there that's just wasted. And you know, the philosophy of the college here is very much in that direction, right? Which is to say we want more financial aid, we want more so that the best people who take it. But by the time people even enter our pipeline, most of it is already lost, right? Yeah, please do.
Describe that as giving that kid a leg up. But from my perspective, hearing what you're saying, I experienced that scenario as you simply working with, I agree with your colleague. I think this is true about talent. I studied talent quite a lot while I was here with a lot of senior people. From my perspective, I just simply see you engaging this situation from the truest working definition one might engage about the nature of talent. So I don't see you giving him a leg up. I see you
Fair enough, yeah.
working with
Sure.
working definition.
Yeah.
That is
Fair
true
enough.
in its application and producing a high performing result.
Yep. 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 I'm currently engaged in building a worldwide charity. John knows about this. You know, we will soon get to 1 million students we will help a year, higher ed students who are disadvantaged backgrounds in colleges around the world, who have no social capital and no prospect, career prospect, because the degrees that they have when they enter the mainstreams in their own countries aren't worth very much. But what I'm doing is I'm putting them through various interventions so that at the end I can say, so-and-so exhibits these kind of characteristics. And my bet is that they will do just as well as anybody else. And you know, unless I can get to 1 million, 2 million, 3 million a year, I can't move the needle. But I'm trying to use our platform here and so much goodwill to do that as in a charitable basis. Anyway, there's more comment. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering what the most effective implementation of meritocracy that you've come across is and why it was a success.
What's your definition of effective?
I think I'll leave that up to you in terms of the people implementing it, being happy with how it turned out.
Personally, I think the most effective thing is just to, a version of the answer I gave that gentleman, the most effective thing is to level the playing field up front so that everyone has the same chance to compete.
Or I mean, is that something that you've seen happen recently, or is that something that
So that is something that has happened in every society episodically for a while, and then people have gotten a leg up, and then something has happened to. So let me show you. This is the picture that to me captures. This is Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill, right? So imagine that you, as a thought experiment, that you start with a new society, right? That everybody is tabula rasa, everybody is completely equal, and you devise a test, any test, whatever test you want. And inevitably, just because of sheer randomness, someone gets ahead, right? That person is, in a behavioral sense, very likely to say in the future, I got ahead because I was smart, or I worked really hard and I got ahead, right? It's human nature. I do it, you probably would do it, all of us would do it. You would say, yeah, sure, I got lucky, but I put in all that time. I'm meritorious. You may not say that, you may not look in the mirror and say that to yourself. I don't, but you would think that in your mind. And then when the time came for your kids and your progeny to have a shot, you would give them a leg up. You just would. I don't know anybody who wouldn't, including me. You would say, hey, you should do this, maybe even unconsciously. These are the kinds of things you ought to be doing, right? You should meet thus and so. This person is really interesting in his or her life experiences. And implicitly, you are providing so much of the social capital that your next gen will need. So what I'm trying to say is that even if you start tabula rasa, and nobody's ahead, within a couple of rolls of the dice, people start getting ahead and behind just from randomness, and then it becomes institutionalized and entrenched. And then when it becomes too entrenched and inequality becomes too much, then you either have a backlash or you have a form of compensatory discrimination. So the reservations that I spoke about in the Indian case of 50% in the elite institutions, I remember as a kid, I was a freshman at Princeton in 1984, and I remember going back home to New Delhi, and there were riots in the street. And there were riots in the street because the backward caste people had gotten very upset, rightfully so, that they were not finding spots anywhere. And so they were on the street, burning shops and turning cars upside down. And the political process kicked in and said, to calm this all down, we're going to have affirmative action. Reservations. The Mandal Commission is what it was called. It was in 1984-85, that time period. So that's what happened. So you start with a clean sheet of paper. Through some process, hierarchy emerges. The quote-unquote meritorious declare themselves to be so. That's the topic of Ajanta's essay on the IIT, is that the people who make the IIT just declare that we are more meritorious. And they begin to think of themselves that way, right? She talks about that psychological. They then help their next generation stack the deck and repeat 5-6 generations, and you have a completely unfair system. I'm describing to you, like a mathematician would, in a very spare model, what I see going on over and over and over again in time and space and society. And this is not an American story. Here, the particular contours are race-based. In India, they're caste-based or language-based. In China, they're location-based. In Malaysia, they're a combination of race and this-based. In Brazil, they're, again, a combination of race and other things. I cannot think of a society where this doesn't play out. Okay? And so you have this compensatory discrimination play out. Yeah? So I'm not answering a question because I don't really have an answer other than to say that I think the more we can try to keep leveling the playing field. So what I'm saying is that nobody's ever kind of cracked this to say now we're all meritorious, or now meritocracy exists, and we've reached a stage where we're all happy with it. There's never perfect happiness. There's always some group feeling like it's being privileged at the expense of others, or others are being privileged at the expense of itself. But that doesn't mean that you don't keep working at it. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that my answer to your question is that you keep leveling the playing field, right? That you look at the people who are relatively less advantaged, and then you find ways to prop it up societally, legally, jurisdictionally, entrepreneurially, whatever arrows you have in your quiver to do that. Yeah.
In these essays, sorry, I didn't know about this book, but of course I'm going to read it. But was there any measurement or perspective of time over the last 75 years in India or China? Has meritocracy increased? I think some of us Indians think that.
Yeah.
So we've had, the prime minister is from the lower caste, as you
Yeah.
know. We had 2 presidents who are from lower classes and
Yeah.
from lower caste. So there's a perception, and I saw some study which says if you look at board memberships, now the IIT elites and all are less than 20% of boards. And there's some empirical work which says over time, India is getting more and more, let's say less equality, more egalitarian. Did you have any perception? Did you have any measurement?
Yeah. I mean, it's engaged within some of these essays also, but what I can share with you is my broader perception, because in pulling together this volume, as I said, there were many workshops, 50, 60 people participating, probably hundreds more consuming and engaging in different ways. My sense is that I don't think India is more egalitarian at all. Can I find particular settings where things have evened out a bit more? Sure, I can find settings. But in the main, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's sobering. It's sobering to realize that the informal Indian workforce, where there is no semblance of meritocracy, is 650 million people. It's a lot of people. 650 million people. And in China, I would say, I'm looking at Mike, I would say it's probably at least 100 million who are complete, more than that, 200 million, who are kind of checked out and don't have any real prospect of playing the game. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that a foundation of with meritocracy
Yeah.
and perpetuation of inequality in the U.S. anyway
Yeah.
is the historical moral precept of what's now called the prosperity gospel, and in the Calvinist times it's called, if you're doing well, God is shining on you, so therefore what you have
Is deserved.
justifiable by
Yes.
divine
Providence, yes.
intervention.
Yeah.
And that's translated into the right of one generation to pass on their God-given
Yeah.
possessions to the next generation.
Yeah.
And in the U.S., the law is designed to basically perpetuate the property.
Well, but a lot less than most other countries.
And I was just curious,
Yeah.
is there, just a follow-up question, but
Yeah.
is there, does this happen in India and China? I mean, is there a kind of divine blessing for the current state of?
Not of the. I'm very sure about India, but not as sure about China. But not of the Calvinist variety. No, there's all sorts of variations of. For those who are in the Taoist tradition or the Buddhist tradition, all kinds of Buddhas that you pray to for prosperity, and all kinds of gods and goddesses that you pray to for prosperity. But I have never heard it articulated quite the way that you do, quite the way that you articulated a strand of American thought. But I did want to comment on one thing you said, that we do have an estate tax in this country. We have an estate tax.
But it's not executed in a way that.
Yeah, but we have a tax. Most countries don't have an estate tax.
Oh, okay.
India has no estate.
This country, the step up,
Yes.
stock thing basically eliminates the use.
Yes. No, I'm fully aware of the machinations. So, and
Can I ask just one follow-up question?
yeah, no, but I did want to pause on this, and then I will let you ask your next question. In India, currently, there is a royal battle going on between the billionaires, of whom we have a goodly amount now, desperately trying to say there should never be an estate tax because we earned this, and that ethos just isn't there. I mean, I don't think Indians are less charitable than non-Indians, but it seems to be that Most countries seem to go through some kind of, dare I say, increasing sophistication towards acts of charity, and India is still in the transition from donating to your local temple or your orphanage, which happens in, plentifully, but not so much donating to, say, a university or, National Public Radio, or pick your Smithsonian Museum or some institution that benefits everybody. India is still stuck in, if I do donate to a university, I want it to be in my mommy's name. And so I'm going to go build a new university that's called Mommy University. And then another guy will say Daddy University and Uncle University. And you've got a plethora of these, but none of them are really becoming institutions yet. So we will get there in India, right? China, I think, is a little bit further ahead. You see more systemic donations happening. Sometimes the party kind of makes you donate. So that's a helpful way to channel funds also. But I'm sorry, I did want to make the point about estate tax, but go ahead, you have another.
So one thing that I would love to get feedback on, and I'm not an economist, but one way of addressing inequality would be moving from an income tax to an asset-based tax. So I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation.
Yeah, I know the results already, but go ahead.
If you taxed assets at 0.3%,
yeah,
you could pay for all the federal
yeah,
government programs, no deficit,
yeah,
and 0.3%, with some exceptions like no tax or limited tax on primary residence, family farms, and that kind of thing. The billionaires would be taxed, say, Elon Musk, 200 and whatever billion, would be taxed at like, he'd have to pay $6 billion in tax. But his assets are growing much faster.
That's 6 billion, yeah.
For the rest of us, almost everyone's taxes would be radically reduced.
Yeah.
So this should be a very popular program. It requires a custom amendment.
Sounds like you have a political career ahead of you.
Anyway, why not? Why isn't this a popular idea?
Because the billionaires will shoot it down. It's very simple. You know the answer to that.
I'm sorry.
The billionaires will shoot it down before you could even tie your shoelace. This is not going anywhere in a hurry. I'm surprised it's even 0.3%. I think it's actually lower than that. But anyway, leave that as it may be. Actually, on a side note, I don't know of any country that levies. Well, you'll be happy to hear that J.D. Vance is going to levy a tax on our asset endowment.
Oh, really? Only on Harvard's assets.
Only on Harvard's assets. Well, and the Ivy Leagues, and that'll create a bit of a ruckus for you. So I've got 10 minutes. It's set till 3, right? Yeah. Should I go through a couple more slides? I'm on slide 2 out of 30, so maybe I go through a couple more. So, okay. The meritorious always stack the deck in favor of their own. And, chapters, they go through so many variations of ways in which basically well-off people look in the mirror and say, look how meritorious I am. And look, my kids must be, they're after all my progeny, they must be as meritorious, and don't they deserve this slightly different set of circumstances? And they work so hard, right? and doing that. So that happens over and over again, right? Trying to think, and there are deliberate measures to limit and interfere with meritocracy throughout. I mentioned regional quotas in China, or points given to various groups of exam takers. I've lost track of what the basis of these are. In India, you've got the system of varnas or castes, which have evolved, since at least 1500 BC, if not before that. Merit in pre-British India was very much predicated on a bunch of things that had nothing to do with exam taking and things of that nature. It had to do, as I sort of facetiously mentioned, with wielding a sword or riding a horse or managing the waterways or whatever was perceived to be in society's interest at the time. And this exam taking thing is a very recent summary statistic for measuring talent, and it is a super inefficient an incomplete measure of talent. I mean, some of you will know Howard Gardner's lovely work at the Ed School here, talking about multiple intelligences and so on. That's but one take on how narrow our assessment system is. The problem is that every time we meaning the academy, has tried to move away from it, the subjectivity introduced has its own sets of problems, which is the point that you were making. So caste continues to be used to allocate education and public sector jobs, and this breeds extraordinary resentment in India now, right? So you have resentment by the lower caste people when they get locked out of opportunity, which is understandable, and now you have resentment by the non-lower caste people saying, why are so many things being locked up for the... So as you can see, it mirrors the affirmative action debate here as well, which is not surprising because structurally it's the same thing. Yeah.
If you do a follow-on thought, I have a suggestion.
Okay, sure.
So from the point of view of a sociologist, which I am not, but I use a lot of sociology
Okay.
as a following political scientist.
Okay.
A sociologist would say, why are you agonizing about all of this? The structural principles are very clear.
Mm-hmm.
We are a competitive species.
Mm-hmm.
We are also a social creature.
Species, yeah, yeah.
And these things are the inevitable consequence, which are ineluctable.
Mm-hmm.
You can only modulate it.
Okay.
So you might incorporate that idea and invite some sociologists for your next one.
Oh, actually, our writers are full of sociology eminences, and in fact, the central message is, dare I say, exactly what you just said. I thought I said it, but I'll repeat it for your consumption. I just said that this is an inevitable consequence of human behavior and human society by extension. And it is like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill, and you can try to tweak it at the margin, and you will improve it within constrained circumstances. But the reality is that the boulder will start pushing you down again, and you'll start over. So I agree with you. That actually is my favorite image to capture the entire book. Okay, give me just 1 second, and I will race through. So these are examples of so Lee. This is the Caltech sociologist now in Hong Kong. Basically looks at 3 regimes in China: the late Qing, the Republican era, and the current People's Republic, and shows how attempts to change the way the boulder is being pushed up the hill, or to forestall its descent down. He points to, I think, 2 or 3 interventions at different points in Chinese history that have all been successful in changing how meritocracy works, but only over several decades, right? And he's trying to give a sense of, yes, it is not that meritocratic systems are immutable. In fact, they're immutable, but they're immutable over long time horizons, relatively long time horizons. So this idea that the court can say no race and then society will recalibrate is poppycock. It's going to take a long time before you actually see a response to it, and then there'll be a response to the response. Okay, historian from I think University of Texas on British India, talking about how talent was allocated in what was then the British Army in India, or the East India Civil Service, and this idea of bringing that the Brits call Indianization very charitably, which is bringing in Indian talent into the Indian Civil Service when the Brits were ruling India, took a very long time to gain acceptance and so on. So I think the message of all this is that attempts to engineer compensatory discrimination or variations thereof can work, but they manifest, their results manifest very slowly. Right? Okay. If I recited this, you would be distressed at my pronunciation. And at this point, I can only recognize about 1/3 of the characters. But I put it up here because this was actually the poem you had to recite to be considered meritorious. This was the exam at one point, that you have to recite this poem perfectly with inflection and all, with the right reverence, and there would be some grand poobah in the audience who decided whether you did it right or wrong, and if you did, you passed, and if you didn't, you didn't. So I put it out there to say that what as a stock reminder to say that our conceptions of talent are, what's the word, concoctions that emerge from time and space and have varied quite dramatically over time. These days it's the SAT, but this is simply, a moment passing in human history. There will soon not be an SAT. Facetiously called Goodhart's law, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Right? We will find a way around it. Human ingenuity will outmaneuver it in some way. Lots of subjectivity. I found myself thinking about, so I'm a senior faculty member, I sit on tenure committees across the university, right? And it's interesting to me that when we write out for letters, when somebody's coming out for promotion, we write out for people to write anonymous letters. It's very interesting to me how subjective that process seems to be, right? Ex ante, we decide that so-and-so their opinions are good, and their opinions are not going to be good because they are not at the right institution, for instance, right? And I'm just putting that up there to say that this subjectivity, that measurement and formalism often has the illusion of objectivity, right? But buried in there is a lot of subjectivity also. Not that it's unfair, not that I have a better way of doing it. It's just that we should at least recognize it for what it is. Right? That's how I would say it. This is a lovely example. One of the scholars, I forget who it is, I think it's a scholar from Beida, Peking University. He has this lovely example in the book of one of the most critical tasks in one of the Chinese dynasties, maybe the Song dynasty, is the management of river works in China, right? That's like the very critical task, because unless the river works are working, the rivers are working properly, the food grains can't be sent to the right place, military supplies can't be moved, and the entire sort of dynasty and the empire collapses. And so it turns out that the only people who are allowed, who are considered meritorious enough to operate the river works, are people who are in just these 4 families. Right? Now, why is that? I mean, don't you think that it's a technical skill and you could train somebody to operate the river works? Well, it turns out that the Chinese state had decided no, that actually only these 4 families could be entrusted with this, because there was this intangible know-how about how rivers are meant to be managed, the ebb and flow of tides and so on, and that these are the only people meritorious enough to be considered stewards of this. I'm giving you these examples because these are real issues of allocation of talent and of measurement of talent. And you can see how, to our modern eyes sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, how utterly random this might seem. Right? Why should the recitation of that poem be the basis of allocation of all kinds of goodies in society, right, for instance? Okay, so there are chapters on technology, which I'm not going to say much about. This is my charity. It's called Aspire Institute. We have about 1 million students going through as of next year, every year. It's just first generation, completely free, first generation poor kids from all around the world who are in colleges. And we find ways to give them greater confidence, work in teams, able to articulate for themselves, to represent their own positions, and so on and so forth. And it's all sort of tech enabled, but it's my attempt to do something about this fiendishly difficult problem. So I'll summarize. The book, Making Meritocracy, relative advantages acquired through fair means or luck are very persistent, and attempts to reset the proverbial table are incomplete and often backfire, right? Good intentions notwithstanding. So that's the first thing that I take away from this. Notice that it doesn't say China, India, or US, because I genuinely think this is true of all societies at this point. This is human nature. As you would say, it's a consequence of humans being a social animal. Yet, optimistically, it's possible to find seemingly immutable inequalities turn out to be quite mutable under targeted policy action, except over long time horizons, very long time horizons. I'm not sure Congress or the American public has the patience to say that we should do this and it'll take 50 years to show up. Meritocracy, it turns out, is never made. It's in the making of meritocracy that wise policy choices present themselves for all societies. So that is all I have to say. Thank you very much. I don't know if you have time for, there's a lady back there, ma'am. Why don't you take the,
One question.
you're it.
It feels to me, thinking about everything, going back to the beginning of the meeting, is that it's almost always cyclical.
It kind of is, yeah.
To progress, if you call it progress, or the changes that are introduced and implemented to make meritocracy then become excessive to others. Then there's the back.
Yeah.
Is that sort of what
Yeah,
you're
that's it. That's the boulder going up the hill and coming back down. Pretty much. And it's been true for thousands of years, at least in China and India, and I've not been conscious about 1,000 years in America yet, but when I look at it, it looks like it's the same movie. Yeah, it's the same movie. It's the same movie playing out. Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.